We can speak to Charles J. Key, who is a US court expert witness. He studied police shootings. He's from Baltimore, but he just happens to be in Inverness on holiday, which is good for us, and he joins us from there. Mr. Key, good to see you. You studied over 1,000 police shootings, hundreds of non-lethal force incidents across America. The simple question is there a problem of racism?
When you say is there a problem of racism, there are racist, yes, in any profession. That doesn't, just apply to Americans. You can make that case. Is it a problem of racism that's driving police-involved shootings? No. Is that ever an issue? It could be. The idea that somehow that you can fit all of this in one container, if you will, that somehow will describe what's going on is just, it's not possible to do that. When you look at a police-involved shooting, you have a standard of evaluation that's set forth by the United States Supreme Court, which all investigatory agencies have to abide. And in those cases, the Department of Justice, and I've testified against police officers for the Department of Justice, in those cases, the Department of Justice will use those standards and evaluate a police shooting. You have so many different potential, not problems, but potential reasons why you might have statistically a number of African Americans that are shot by police officers. You can look at that. That doesn't really tell you anything. Again, it goes back to the individual shooting and the facts of that. In the whole, most police shootings, most uses of force are absolutely reasonable. That's the standard, objectively reasonable. And, for instance, in Ferguson, the Department of Justice, after an exhaustive investigation, found that the shooting there that sparked Black Lives Matter was, in fact, objectively reasonable.
When you talk about reasonable, though, are you saying that in that instant the police officer thought his life was reasonably in danger and therefore responded with force?
His life or the life of someone else. That's the way it's actually taught. And here's the thing that most people don't understand. It has to be perceived from the view of an objectively reasonable officer. People don't understand that. That's the law. That's what the Supreme Court has said. Not from the perception of the victim, not for the fact that the individual may be unarmed, not for the fact that the back's turned, whatever else. It's at the precise time the force is used, whether or not the officer objectively believed that his life or the life of someone else was in danger of either being killed or serious injury.
But at the bottom of this, if the police officer is thinking it's reasonable, then surely at the very heart of this is this pervasive stereotyping of black people, that if they're carrying a weapon, as Philando Castile was, then they must ultimately be a criminal.
No. When you look at those videos, and I've looked at both of them, both the Minnesota video and the Baton Rouge video, when you look at them, you hear... Of course, the video in Minnesota doesn't actually show the shooting. It shows the aftermath of the shooting. And you hear the officer say over and over again, I told him not to reach. I told him not to reach. When you do that, you then have to determine whether or not the individual that was shot was doing something that put the officer in such fear that the officer had to use lethal force.
So are you saying that if that suspect was reaching for his driving license, the policeman is likely to get off because he thinks his life is at risk?
No, that's a...
Because that's what he was doing, right? That's what he was doing.
We actually don't know that. We don't know that. See, that's part of the thing. People make assumptions. That was the perception of the lady that was there that was videotaping after the shooting occurred. She said that. We don't know that that's actually the case. Was he reaching for the license? How was he doing that? Was he reaching for where the gun was? Then you have to go back, and it's not a question of getting off. It's the question of whether or not an objectively reasonable officer, in perceiving what the individual was being told to do, and according to the officer, and by the way, I'm not making a determination one way or the other. I'm simply going by what the record is. The officer says he kept telling him not to do that, and he did it anyway.
It seems to me, though, that you're putting on this, and quite reasonably, a sort of an attitude that the law would put on it, and this is where the fault line is that a lot of police officers are not being prosecuted because in the eyes of the law it is reasonable, but perhaps to the layman looking at this, it's not reasonable at all, is it?
Well, no, that's a good point. Here's what I think part of the problem is. One, you've got people on all sides of this that are instigating for their own purpose, and so they, instead of looking at it from the standpoint of how the law looks at it, or from the standpoint of how a reasonable officer, they look at it from the standpoint of that this can never happen. And I'm not categorizing Black Lives Matter, but assuming because an individual is African American that the person should never be shot. That's one extreme. You're absolutely right. Part of the problem is that the public needs to be educated as to how police officers are taught and the law that they're taught, and how they will use lethal or how they will use force. Because if you're a driver in a car and a police officer has a gun drawn, pointed at you, and the police officer says, do not reach for it, and you reach for it, you are putting your life at risk. Now, I don't know that that's what happened in Minnesota. I don't know. I don't know whether the cop there was right, wrong. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that when you view those situations, it is a lot more complicated than somebody's account that, well, he was reaching for his driver's license. It's just not that simple.
Very interesting. Mr. Key, thank you very much for interrupting your holiday to come and talk to us.
Thank you.